Okay, so hello everyone. Hello dear friends, dear colleagues. It's really good to see you. Some of you I haven't seen for many years. Others are, we've been Zooming every week, like Jihan or Alessandro. So dear panelists, dear moderator, dear participants, we have some grantees here and some filmmakers as well. The team, the guest, good evening. So my name is Mohammed. I'm Documentary Africa Executive Director. So it's an honor to welcome you on this panel and for this discussion. So maybe a quick word about DocA. It's a unique Pan-African initiative. We're trying to cultivate and nourish a self-sustaining documentary film ecosystem on our continent. So what we do is we provide financial support in form of grants for development, production, post-production, and impact production. We also give training opportunities through workshops, through labs and residency, through different collaboration with DocA organization on the continent and worldwide. And we also offer mentorship and consultation to African documentary filmmakers. This is some of the services that we're trying to provide to the documentary film ecosystem. As Mudamba have said, we are excited. We're collaborating with the Skidmore College, and we are participating in this More Documentary Studies Collaborative Forum that's going to be happening in June. It's a weekend of public events, and this theme for this year is co-creation, delights, discontent, and dislocation. So our topic is the presence of African expertise in the global industry. So I just want you to introduce to you our moderator, our colleagues and friends, Peter Mudamba, but we call him Mudamba. Mudamba is a program director at DocuBox. DocuBox is the East African Documentary Film Fund. It is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And without further ado, I'd give the floor to Mudamba.
Hello and greetings to you all. Welcome to this moment where we're going to have a great discussion with industry leads in Africa, and to be able to delve into the discussion of co-creation and collaboration has already been introduced by Mohammed. We shall also be looking at the area of the entrance of streamers into Africa. And in all this, we'll be able to look at the experts who exist in the African continent. And then we shall also delve into the delights, discontents, and dislocations that have been brought about by these two topical areas. So we have actually chosen to go into two wide areas, and those two wide areas that we shall be discussing today shall be co-creation and collaboration. That will be the first one. Then we shall go into the second one at some point to discuss the entrance of streamers into the African space. And we shall be focusing on IP, and as part of IP, we shall also be looking at ownership. I would like to just, by way of recognizing all the panelists who are with us, be able to say that we have Alessandro, we have Joslyn Barnes, we have Saitabao Kaiyare, we have Toni Kamau, we have Sam Soko, we have Femi Odugbemi, and we have El-Tahri. And I'm sure that at some point, each of them, because they have a voice, will be able to then fully introduce themselves by giving their full names and telling you what they do and which areas of film production they are involved in, or the academia. We also have, as part of this discussion, Josh Mamunga, who will also introduce himself. We have Reni and we have Austin, who are also part of DocA. So before we go into the panel discussion, may I just have Reni and Austin to say a word, and if Josh can, then we shall go into introducing properly all the panelists and go into the discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rainy. I'm the administrator at DocA, and I'm glad to be part of this discussion this evening. Let's engage and have a good time.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Austin Nyombok. I'm the communications officer, and I'm excited to be part of this discussion. And I'm glad to be able to have an amazing assortment of African minds to deal with cinema, to speak to us and to speak to this auspicious topic that we have. And thank you, Mudamba, for steering the ship.
Josh.
Thanks, Mudamba. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to an extremely interesting and informative and perhaps insightful discussion on this important topic of co-creation and collaboration on the continent and further afield. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I know that there are other surprise faces in this space, and I'll let them be introduced at the point when necessary, because I want to believe there's a reason why we have the guests who are with us too. For now, I'll let this intro go into a deeper intro, starting off with Alessandro, whom I'm seeing on next to me on the screen. So Alessandro, please do.
Thank you very much, Mudamba. I'm Alessandro Jedlowski. I'm a member of DocA board, and I'm a researcher. I've been working over the past 10 years on African cinema and African film industries, and I now work at the Institute of Political Science in Bordeaux in France, where I chair a program on African diaspora and diasporic media.
Josh Barnes, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joslyn Barnes. I'm a film producer based in New York with a company called Louverture Films, which I co-founded with Danny Glover, activist Danny Glover, in 2005. And so appreciate being here. I'm also a board member of DocA.
Great. We now go next to Saitabao Kaiyare.
Hello, everyone. My name is Saitabao Kaiyare. I am a filmmaker from Nairobi, Kenya. I run a company called Baru Collective, where we try to do films that reimagine and rethinks the African continent.
Then we go to Jihan El-Tahri.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jihan El-Tahri. I'm a filmmaker, producer, visual artist, and currently the general director of DocS, which is a support and training and funding institution for Arab African region documentary filmmakers.
We now go to Femi Odugbemi.
Hi, everybody. My name is Femi Odugbemi from Lagos. I am a co-founder of the I Represent Documentary Film Festival. I run a production company called 24 Media. I'm a producer and a filmmaker. And I'm also the academic director for the Multi-Choice Talent Factory for West Africa.
Great. We now move to Toni Kamau.
Hi, everyone. My name is Toni Kamau. I run a production company called We Are Not the Machine. We tell stories of outsiders, rebels, and change makers. We recently co-produced Softy, which is at Sundance last year, and produced I Am Samuel, which premiered at Hot Docs and had its European premiere at BFI. Very excited to be here. Thanks.
Great. We now go to Sam Soko.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Soko. I'm a director-producer based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I work very hard to make good films while having lots of fun.
Great. I hope I'm done with the panelists. Now we shall go into the topic of co-creation and collaboration, and I want to believe that Alessandro is ready to kick it off for us. Please tell us your experiences with co-creation, collab, and collaboration, and what your take will be on it in terms of who are the experts we have in South Africa at some point, and also please remember to also give us what you feel are some of the delights, discontent, and dislocations.
Thanks, Mudamba. I'm a scholar, so I will rather less speak about my own experience in co-production or collaboration, as I haven't had much of them, but rather the experience of research I had around Africa and the feelings and impression I had on this topic. And my idea was to try to delve into this topic, to try to maybe open up elements for the discussion for the roundtable. So when thinking about this topic, I was trying to create a mental order on how to approach it. First idea for me was that even if many of the people around this table engage in many different kinds of collaboration at the same time, collaboration with other African producers and African actors, collaboration with international actors, and so on. I think it could be productive to try to think at different categories of co-production and collaboration that can exist. First of all, I would think at the intra-African collaborations, thinking at what happens between different African countries or within countries of Africa. And I think in this, thinking about this, it is important to keep in mind, in a way, the legacy of colonialism that still sort of have an impact on the real possibilities of collaboration, particularly between different regions. I'm thinking at the sort of artificial division between Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone areas or Arabophone areas, and how these regions and these divisions still have an impact on the concrete chances and possibilities of collaboration. And also the problem of intra-African knowledge and exchange. I would say that my experience doing research is that often, unfortunately, still the exchange beyond filmmaking between people of that belongs to different areas or even different countries, for a number of reasons, are still somehow harder than a connection with, let's say, Western countries or non-African countries, for a number of reasons, including the fact that simply transport is still, international transport is kind of easier to go outside of Africa than to move within Africa in a way. So this sort of legacies have an impact, in my view, in making intra-African collaborations harder, even if things are changing. And of course, experience like DocA, Waga Film Lab, and many others that are also represented here around the table show the fact that things are moving on and transforming. Then there is the issue of North-South collaboration. And I think that there we enter into sort of, again, a different world in which there again, I think that the legacy of the historical legacy of colonialism, imperialism have an impact in how new paradigms and new forms of interaction happen, and how older frames tend to at times replicate themselves implicitly in new ways of interaction. And in this sense, I think that most of all the issue is also how these older paradigms sort of find a way of replicating themselves into this capitalist system that still regulates much of the production and distribution of films. If we will go to the discussion about streaming platforms, even if some streaming platforms actually seem to engage a lot with Africa or with minority, then I think we still need to ask ourselves how this is used within a logic of commodification of difference in the systems of global capitalism. Then, of course, there is the growing issue of South-South collaborations, which I think is also very interesting to think about. And when I say South-South, is very much of a simplification as a term, but we can think of, let's say, the growing role of China and Chinese media companies in the continent, but also Indian or Brazilian, or and these, of course, are not new. There is a very old history of relation. Jihan has made one of the most beautiful films on Cuban presence in Africa. So, and there are so many other experiences. But here, I think that it is hard to sort of have a critical approach, because there is often a lot of enthusiasm as well in this shifting landscape. But at the same time, it also belongs to a phase in the evolution of capitalism in which still things are moving, but maybe the basic elements and the basic logics are not really changing that much. So, but my experience in working on China-Africa interactions is that what is really important and interesting is to look case by case and really try to analyze the specificity of each actor's objectives and action. If you think at the various Chinese companies that are working in Africa, they cannot be just simplified to a global paradigm of China and Africa. Each of them work according to different rationalities and rationals and objectives. So And to conclude, I would think that also we need to include also the whole discussion about the diasporic interaction, which is also sort of another line of collaboration, which I would like to differentiate from the other sort of form of collaboration, because it has also other potentially other ideological motivation, other forms of solidarity, but also other risks, which are the risks of believing that you know already each other and that you already have a basis for collaboration, and sometimes this is more a problem or a source of misunderstanding than an actual resource. So I will stop here because time flies and there are many people around the table, but I can delve more into it later if you want.
Thank you, Alessandro. I think you've actually been able to elaborate and to break it down for us a lot more on the historical front. We've been able to look at collaboration in terms of how Africa was divided into Anglophone, Francophone, the Arabic nations, etc. We've actually also looked at the intricacies of movement in Africa, which make it difficult for collaboration to take place. You've talked about the North-South kind of difficulties and then South-South entrance into the space. I would like to let Jihan El-Tahri also come into it, but as she gets into it, I would also ask her to most likely give us a bit of definition or understanding on the issues about co-creation and whether co-creation and co-production actually mean the same thing or not as she goes into her presentation. Thank you, Jihan.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be with all of you, and thank you, Alessandro. You covered quite a bit of ground there. I think I prefer to make very clear distinctions between collaboration, co-production, co-creation, although we tend to, just for facility, use them interchangeably. But I think we're at a moment of time where they're very visible. The notion of collaboration in all its forms is something that's very much at the forefront. We're seeing collectives starting all over the continent. In Nairobi, there are collectives like the Nest. In Libya, there's a collective called Hunna. and I won't go through all of them because like over the past 4 or 5 years, the concept of working collectively together to overcome all sorts of challenges is like growing like wildfire. Co-production, I would say, is something very specific to making the film. Now, the system as it has been working, let's say at least over the past 20 years, let's say 25 years, has integrated co-production as an instrumental element in making a film go beyond borders, which wasn't the case, let's say 30 years ago. It started off as budgets were shrinking, people of similar minds or similar spaces started saying, well, I'll come with you into the production and then you'll have the money. But now it has become almost an integral part of the system. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to co-production, and I think it really depends on how you structure your co-production. So, for example, personally, one of my first films, let's say my 3 first films, the concept of co-production didn't exist in the world. So you had one entity investing in your film and you made the film and that was that. And then from after the 3rd film, I had 3 co-producers, which was like crazy. How do we actually do this? And my very last film, I had 13 co-producers. But ironically, having 13 co-producers is much easier than having 3 because it gives you much more independence. anybody who asks me something, oh, sorry, the other co-producers might not be happy. So it's also about how do you structure it? How do you actually engage with that system and what does it do? Now, co-creation is something completely different. And I have to say, I'm kind of dubious about why the concept of co-creation is becoming more and more of a buzzword over the past year or two. And co-creation is really about, I actually found something, an interesting definition, which is basically, it's, oh, where did it go? Basically, it's about the citizens' involvement. It starts with the idea of social innovation, okay? It's a kind of a magical concept which during recent years have been embraced as a new reform strategy for the public sector. Given the social challenges and budget austerity with which governments are wrestling, co-creation and social innovation is an inspiring concept, but difficult to wrestle with. That is one of the, because basically the co-creation is about citizens and people themselves implementing part of something that is supposed to be done by the government, conceptually, okay? Now, that's kind of, I was quite glad when Alessandro talked about the capitalism. You're pushing the capitalist notion even a step further with the concept of co-creation, because creation in the film industry is really about the idea, the film, the visual, the storytelling aspect. That's the creative side. Yes. Now, the production and the rest of it is the implementation side. So when we start talking about co-creation and mixing the implementation and the logistical side with the artistic side, we immediately go into a real question about droit moral, the moral rights. The moral rights, it's basically about the integrity of artistic work. It's about preserving the integrity, which allows the author or the conceptor to object to any alterations, distortions, mutilations, and anything that is prejudicial to the author's conception of what he wanted to tell. Okay? It doesn't necessarily touch on copyright in its economic form. And I think when we start talking about co-creation, we kind of mix the moral right with the economic and copyright, and we end up losing sight of what is important here. I see myself personally, primarily as a filmmaker, and as a filmmaker, I'm a storyteller. And it's the story I want to tell and how I want to tell it. That is the most important thing. Let me just get back to...
Before you get back, Jihan, because you've touched on a sore area a bit, how do you then divorce the issue of IP rights, the rights of the holder of the idea, when you're talking about co-creation? A quick assumption, I am co-creating with Sam Soko and Toni Kamau, and we are 3 people co-creating. Who keeps the IP rights? Is that part of the discussion? Is that part of your thinking and your notion?
I mean, you see, that's why I ended up by saying copyright is one thing and creation is another thing. Because when you do co-producing, you give away bits of your copyright to whoever is co-producing, okay? But no one takes away my film as me being my child. I call it my child. We can all be part of raising that child. Yes.
I just want to hold the question and say, so it means that when you are in co-production, nobody has taken over your child. You're just raising the child together. That's yes. Co-production. But when it comes to co-creation, it becomes a bit of a difficult thing, because who are the 3 people or 4 people in bed co-creating to get this child?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that's a distinction that other people could maybe discuss further. Cool. But I want to get into something that Alessandro was saying about the collaboration.
As you conclude.
Go to conclude the collaboration. I think the inter-African collaboration space is really growing. So just on a personal level, we just over the past year, DocS has created a program called Women in Docs, where collectively 6 women from 6 different countries, all from the continent, work together to co-create, that's why I wanted to say, co-create a film. So working on this idea of creating a film collectively, and it belongs to everyone, is also on the cards. And we were, DocS was also part of founding a program called CENTU, which is trying to connect the north of the continent, the Arab world, if you want to call it, with the South. So I think these initiatives to work together across the continent, sort of horizontally and vertically, does not negate the need and the importance of working between the South and the North. But learning how to work together needs to start with initiatives where we put this in practice. So obviously, what Alessandro said about transport and means and things like that, but language and the different heritage is one of the biggest stumbling blocks. And obviously, we thought we were going to forget all the colonial parameters and, we don't care what language they speak, we're going to go ahead and do it anyway, which is what we did. But we obviously underestimated the cost of translations. Mm-hmm. And it's something we learn for next time. So I don't think we cannot overcome it, but we need to recognize the investment we have to put in ironing out these complications. Thank you.
Great. Anybody else is free to go for the area of co-creation and co-production? I know that could be a number of people who have something to say. Either you can raise your hand and just go for it, or you can just go for it.
Speak just briefly to this. I mean, I think that both Jihan and Alessandro raised very important point insofar as you really can't separate the creative aspects, the process aspects, and the structural underpinning aspects in this idea of co-creation. And I like the question of co-creation because it aims directly at the heart of documentary ethics, like who can make an image of whom, what meaning do these images have, how do they circulate, how are they used, how can we do no harm to the people who participate in our films? Do we assume that they participate in our films? And I also think, it's an alternative to a single author vision, that projects can emerge from a process and evolve with communities. And there's a radical potential to make films with people rather than about people. It doesn't require multi-authors to do that, but it can actually reframe the ethics of who creates and how and why. And I think it also goes to some issues that Teju Cole raised along some years ago, which I think were really important in terms of prioritizing, addressing issues of structural injustice over our supposed freedom. as if like, our ideas of freedom aren't a result of our conditioning, because we bring so many assumptions to the table. So when I think about co-creation, in a way, there's part of me that doesn't believe in the auteur, insofar as I think auteurs have been created to be exploited and monetized. And it's also always been a kind of gendered concept that men produce, women reproduce, and reproduction is not even valued as production. But I also think that artists undeniably have unique visions and are in a way mediums and translators and interpreters, and can really awaken us to new ways of seeing. So I just feel like as a white person from the States, thinking about working and co-creating or co-producing, because they are two very different things, with colleagues in Africa, that I would start by not defining it and simply listening and permitting it to evolve organically as it suits the project. And because that allows my own practices to be interrogated based on the perspectives and experiences of others. And I also have a suspicion that in some cases, co-creation is a kind of Trojan horse to just, way for white people to insert themselves into projects where they don't belong, under the aegis of this idea of co-creation. And that we have to be very careful about how we think about that versus co-production. I could say a lot more about structural issues. I think that this is a very important conversation about how the imagination has been shaped by colonialism, where documentary has its origins, and also just to say, let's not forget that Africa was decolonized. It's the colonizer who hasn't been decolonized. And that there's an elite in Africa that's also been educated by the colonizer, since the World Bank convinced so many African leaders to emphasize lower education over higher education, and very conveniently defanged the university as a center of resistance to dictatorship. But there's a way in which, Western institutions and neoliberal capitalism has created an elite that has its boot on the neck of everyone else on the continent. And that's not just in Africa, that's everywhere. I mean, that is a new form of colonization, and that directly affects the production of images, and imaging has fed right into that. So I think we have to have this conversation in a kind of, to also consider the structural underpinnings, which both Jihan and Alessandro referred to. But I don't see how to divorce that conversation from the co-creation conversation.
Very deep indeed. I think I would want to hear what Femi has to add, because he had his hand up, and I want to believe that there'll be an interesting rejoinder or some interesting update from him.
I just wanted to add a bit from my perspective to what's been said. In terms of co-creation as something that we also have to seriously consider as a tool to work with the evolution of storytelling itself in this generation. The idea that the themes and subject matters are no longer captured in a particular geographic entity. The idea that you live across, whether it's, vertical or horizontally in Africa, where the issues are repetitive, exactly the same, where the characters and actors and those you might call the antagonists are really exactly caricatures of each other, and the experiences under this situations to create these stories are shared. And given that, documentary is still mostly in the hands of institutions in Africa, and the work that we do is how do we move it into the hand of individuals, it's going to become more and more important that the authoring of ideas, the storytelling itself, will have to be shared, not just captured in one environment, but shared across, because essentially speaking, you may be only able to do one film for many spaces at a time. And that has nothing to do with co-production. It just has a lot to do with documentary itself as a tool for facilitating change. I also wanted to add, and for this generation of young filmmakers, documentary is not attractive simply because of its economy. And so it's important that because what it what we get back from making it is that, you know, we're empowered. We're empowering us to actually be able to affect reality in cultural ways. It becomes important to be able to spread the risk, stories, spread the. That's not a luxury. Apart from that, there's also the impact of technology. We've got to understand that beyond film, people are documenting their experiences via technology. Social media is very active in terms of how people are documenting experiences. We had this big riot in Nigeria, well, not a riot, the protests, you know, the NSAS protests, and almost all the documentary films that are emerging from it are collages of people who had their phones out during the riots. Most of those who could capture that captured it on their phones. Most of the films and government and regular filmmakers who were there were rounded up by the security services and their materials taken. So people are creating collages based on where they were during the riots and creating stories that spread beyond one location. And so there is a way for the concept of co-creation to also help, particularly this generation, to further their capacity to make documentary itself be useful beyond, you know, the economic return or you know, the filmmaker authorial rights into actually something that collaboratively makes a difference.
I also have a question for you, Femi. You've talked about quite a number of things. You went into the sharing of whatever films are produced in collaboration. You've gone into social media and talked about unstructured way of co-creation. But I'm also fascinated, and I'm asking myself, is there a structured way in which, for example, people are co-creating in West Africa? Teams are meeting and making sure that documentary films are moving forward. Is there something that's taking place? Because as a person who's part of the head of the talent factory and at the same time head of IREP, you most likely are in the know. Your eyes must be in the space. So in 2 minutes.
Well, I don't need 2 minutes really, but the structure of the talent factory is to encourage co-creation. Whether we like it or not, the creative young people across Africa are creating together. They're talking, they're exchanging stories. They're doing it whether in written form, in digital form, in fictional form. We're encouraging it as an essential part of their exchange. That's one part. But I think as a festival, we've really been blessed to be able to bring filmmakers from different parts of Africa to one space. We show films at Freedom Park. So we actually have opportunities for a lot of filmmakers from different places, you know, to sort of to meet, to talk, to try to create things. But what they're exchanging really is capacities, the ability to realize that a lot of the stories that I think are original to my side are actually things that are actually happening on another side. And I think the whole concept of IREP as a space for self-conversations for Africa just dovetails into this concept of co-creating, not just as a reality that's emerging, but as something we need to particularly encourage in a space where money is not that easy to find and the experiences are basically shared.
Great. Let me try and shift the gear and come to East Africa and just hear from either of the East African persons who are here on this matter of co-creation and collaboration. Anyone who's just ready to go.
Yeah, so I can go first. I can just speak briefly. Yeah, I think it's interesting, like just talking about like co-creation, collaboration. You know, who has worked on 2 features as a producer, I think the approach has always been quite collaborative, with the directors, and Jos had talked about the auteur, the person who's seen as the creative, but like she mentioned, like it takes a village, to tell a story. And I think that we have been co-creating, we have been collaborating on these different projects. I think the question is about how it's framed by press, by festivals. And I think that's what we need to also just start talking about, because I feel like it's something that happens organically, because you cannot really create different people. Like, for example, Softy, it was directed by Soko and produced by him and edited by him, but then they were co-editors who gave their perspective, like looking at footage. We all looked at footage and scenes, and we all discussed, like our perspective on what we saw. And it was interesting to see like the Canadian editors and their perspectives, like a white Canadian editor giving his perspective on Kenyan politics, and then, a Canadian editor who has another ethnicity giving his perspective, and Soko as the director who also filmed and also edited giving his perspective, my perspective as a woman, looking at certain scenes. And there was some level of co-creation and collaboration that happened in terms of like ending up with a story. It's just that the way the film industry is structured, like people are assigned roles, and for economic reasons, of course, and also just for structural reasons, because everyone can't do everything at the same time. But I think that there's also some work that needs to happen just with framing, so that also people can understand that this idea of, producing a documentary or directing a documentary or creating content is not something insurmountable. And it's not something that is, I think, a heroic venture that is done by a single person, kind of like dismantling the auteur concept, which I think has its role, but I think is also kind of destructive, especially at this point in time where we're also trying to dismantle Western capitalism, where a lot of power is, accumulated at the top by one person. So I think there's just interesting conversations about reframing how we look at co-creation and collaboration.
And even as you go to the next person who will speak, in the East African region, has it come off as one of the powerful ways of being able to produce a film? Is it really possible for a person, even though they were a single producer on their own, to run the race and be able to finish without co-creators coming in and co-producers coming in, and like, how has that been? Maybe it goes to the next person.
Oh, sorry, I can go.
Yeah, please.
Mudamba, no, like there's no way you can do it alone. Like it's a lie you can tell yourself at night, but it's not possible. Like Toni said, it takes a village, but even to put a spanner in the works, whenever you're directing a film, particularly when you're filming in this continent and filming in Kenya in particular, you find that the people you're filming with are the ones who direct what you're filming in many ways. They're the ones who allow you to come into a particular spaces. They're the ones who tell you, come on this day, don't come on this day. I was giving an example of a foreign crew that came to make a film, and they had to be told, whoever they were filming was telling them, come on this day, come at this time, come, you can only shoot this, don't shoot this. That is directing in every sense of the word. So those people are collaborative in the same breath. So I echo what Toni is saying, and in the whole conversation of co-creation, collaboration, and co-production, I think all of them have to be had, but also with a sense of how do we decolonize not only our sense of engagement in making of our films, but the industry as well, and how the industry perceives us as filmmakers.
Great.
Yeah,
please, Saitabao, go.
Yes. So basically, from my perspective, I know about co-creation and collaboration from a bittersweet perspective. It has its ups, it has its downs. Particularly when I was doing my documentary film project, I had to co-direct. So this was co-directing between a Kenyan and a German. So it's two different cultures, and clashing. But whatever the outcome that came out of it was beautiful, because I think, especially based on the theme of our project that we're working on, it was about colonialization. It is about European objects in Western museums that belong to Africa. So for us, it was kind of a perfect balance between, you have someone from Germany and you have someone from Kenya. So there are places where I couldn't be able to access in Germany. And my co-director, there are places where she couldn't access when we were shooting here in Kenya. So that whole process of co-creating and collaborating kind of made our film better, I would believe, because we had two different people from two different perspectives and two different worlds. So especially also when it comes to filming in Africa, it was also part of like a responsibility as an African filmmaker, how Africa is portrayed and how it's presented. Especially, it's very notorious when it comes to documentary filmmaking, how Africans are portrayed, because it's a very sort of Western way of shooting and, getting a shot or telling a story, a documentary story that will please the Western market. But as an African filmmaker, I was like, no, this is how we should do it, because this is how the story should be told, and also to treat people with respect. And that's where you can get more out of them.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, I think that has taken us to some great space where I want to most likely now go into concluding matters around co-creation and collaboration. And if there are any concluding either a question that one would like to get answered quickly, or if there are any issues that would need to be looked at, it will be this moment that works out. Anything?
Can I just say a couple of things here, because what we've been describing, and especially what Toni was saying, is absolutely true, 100%. But I think what Toni and Jos, for example, as producers, they're creative producers. But I mean, I work a lot with labs and a lot with young filmmakers, and very often you end up with producers who just get the money and do not engage with the content. And one of the things we lack most on the continent is creative producers. And I think it's really important, such collaboration, because as Sam, Toni, and everyone has said, it does take a village to create a film, to create a story, to bring up a child, so to speak. But we have a huge lack of creative producers on the continent. So very often when it comes to co-production, our co-producer is somewhere from the West who does not get involved and just brings some money and expects all the returns without engaging in that role. And that's what I have issue with when I talk about co-creation. And as they were saying, that collaboration comes from very early on. I mean, Muhammad, Femi, all of us have been working for years in the Durban lab, the Talent Campus, Swagger Lab. I mean, all of them. We start engaging with the films from the idea point and working with them. So of course, but how do we distinguish support from collaboration, from rights, from all these distinctions? And I agree and disagree at the same time, it being the system. It is the system. But I think what Saitabao said is really important, because he came back to the main, for me, structural issue, which is the formatting of documentary. We now have an expectation that this is how a documentary should be. And if that's how it is, then it's going to go international. And then the famous universal word, all these things mean that we're streamlined in a process. And the system, yes, we need to deconstruct it, but we can't deconstruct one side that kind of points the finger at auteur, because auteur is not just about the Western system. I mean, auteur is the exact, I mean, like the third cinema, when it started, it was very much about we have a voice and that is how we want to tell it. And not just because you're going to get me some money, am I going to change what I want to say? And so I do think that if we throw the baby with the bathwater, we don't have to call it auteur, we can find a new name for it, but relinquishing the idea that we do have a right to a distinct and singular voice as a filmmaker, it would be a shame. And formatting is the big culprit in all of this, in my opinion.
So the distinct African voice for the filmmaker is important. I also would like to just hear in conclusion about co-creation from Jos when it comes to outside Africa experiences. And at times, if it is possible also at this particular point, it would be good to point a bit, if it is possible, at co-production treaties and the place of co-production treaties and if they're existing or not.
I mean, again, I'll try to be brief because I think it's more interesting to hear from my African colleagues on this. But I think, I mean, we talk a lot about changing the narrative by changing the narrator. And I think that is a very important point. I mean, whose stories get told and by whom is central to this question. And I also think sometimes narrative itself is a problem. And the way that we've been conditioned to think about narrative is, to what extent narrative serves to justify oppression. Where does it come from? We know the history of documentary as an instrument of colonizing project, but how do we become self-aware in our own interactions with our own communities and when we venture from our own communities? And so I think this is, when I think about some of the co-productions that we've done, as opposed to, and I'll say co-production rather than co-creation, because sometimes the lines are blurred, but I feel clear as a producer when I'm collaborating creatively with a director who has invited me into the process of that co-creation, that does start at the beginning and runs all the way through production into also the marketing and sales. And this comes back to the structural issue, but I start with the premise of working with people who are interested to not necessarily try to jam their project into a structural system in the race to the lowest common denominator, but rather thinking about who are the audiences we want to see. Because I think if we start with the premise, and this is what's hard, I mean, because you're also coming from the States, I'm coming from a place of privilege de facto, where, this question can be asked. I remember sitting in a panel, this must have been 10 years ago in Durban, on a finance panel where everyone on the panel was white. And there was an African colleague who got up and said, what is it that you people want to see? And I thought, well, this is exactly the problem, is this question. This is the worst question imaginable to be asked. And every single person on the panel answered that question with a straight face. And I thought, good God, right there is the issue, is that there's no reason on earth why that question should be asked. And this is, we cannot defeat the sort of, corporate colonization project on its own terms. I think we have to set our own terms, and we have to think about what is the audience we want to see, because audiences are also created. And the fact is, the audiences are being created everywhere all the time. So how do we use the art form in a way to reinvent how, in a project to sort of not only decolonize, but also see differently. I mean, get beyond our own conditioning. How do labs play a role? And I think in the West, labs are playing a role, unfortunately, in corralling people towards a certain kind of marketable project, to Jihan's point, but that's also because filmmakers have articulated the desire to see their work made and funded and financed. So this is where it's interrelated, how do we get beyond How do we get beyond that? And that's where I think collectives are responding. Together, the idea of an ecosystem that looks at this as a structural problem, or if you want to call it format, but also how can we think about this in a structural way? I mean, even looking at the spectacle of vaccine apartheid and the way that the media presents the so-called refugee crisis. I mean, this idea of rescue, this idea of an incapacity that strikes me as particularly aimed at Africans and the African diaspora. There's this kind of implicit undertow of a so-called incapacity, which is really a stand-in for the crimes of colonizers. Imperialism, colonialism, privatization, extraction, destruction, enslavement. I mean, this is where it comes from. And this is where, when we get into empathy and questions of, what is documentary and what is the purpose of documentary, that there is actually a structural problem and a structural antagonism that we have to consider. And so when we talk about co-creation, I think we have to go back to who owns and runs the data, who's owning the algorithms, who's, managing this, who's governing our media and platforms, who's owning this, and how do we build a public trust? And for example, like, why on earth isn't the internet considered a public utility? But then, we consider the privatization of all public utilities in Africa.
I think that was very, very important, Joslyn. I think you've gone into some very important area, especially when you finish with the who owns the data, who runs the show, who is providing the finances. And I think when you talk about colonialism and the perpetration of colonialism and the continuation of it, it becomes very, very important. We are transitioning shortly, but there was a question which came around on what Soko had asked. How do you handle that character who wants to dictate what time, how the shoot will go, and what is to be done and what's not to be done? And I think this is a director who's most likely grappling with nearly the same thing. So I would want that question to get answered. But as we answer that, to also realize that now we have gone into the last half, and the last half for me will then take us into the issue of the streamers, and we shall be looking at the streamers in the same breath that we've actually done on this line, unless Mohammed Umar has an issue. I usually see him raise the hand. I think he's asking a question and says no. There he is, Mohammed Umar.
Okay, thank you, Mudamba. Now, just maybe trying to give a little bit of an answer to Sam's question. I think we also have to focus on the filmmaker and his relationship with the people he's filming. I think in documentary, what you do, what comes on the screen is the relationship that you have established or not with your protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
That's mainly what comes out on the screen. And that's a creation. That's a collaborative process. How do you manage that collaborative process, knowing that, of course, we have the labs, we have the development labs that they've been doing the rounds, but once you're in the reality of shooting, then the co-creation or collaboration, that's where it's really in effect. How do you manage that human relationship that you have with your protagonist, or even with yourself if you are in the middle of the film? And that's a constant process that you really don't, sometimes it's you just dive in and you have to readjust yourself maybe while you're shooting as well, which is very interesting, because then the collaboration and co-creation is a constant process in the art of making the film. And Jihan touched a point about what is this art form these days? How do you deal with this art form when it's a constant, it's moving art form, Now you can add animation to it, you can stage some stuff into it, the art form is so huge, so vast, that it allows and it needs, and it compels you, it forces you to constantly collaborate when you're in the process as a filmmaker, on the ground shooting. And for me, that's the core of the question, is the art form itself needs collaboration with your protagonist on the ground when you're shooting?
Great. I think that's a very good place to end this collaboration and co-creation discussion. Now we go into the last phase of this discussion. We have 30 minutes to go into it. And we are just going to talk about the entry of streamers into Africa. And then let's look at the question of IP, ownership, the kind of delights or disruptions it has brought into the space. And I want to leave the floor to anyone who's just ready to go for it.
Yeah, maybe I can just pick up on something that was brought up about data, yeah. Which is something that's really problematic, which again goes to Western capitalism and the fact that people's private information is owned by private institutions that monetize it. And I think it's a great thing that we have streamers coming in, but then now we have Western institutions that are now collecting all of this data about African audiences, which unfortunately hasn't been done to such a degree by public broadcasters or organizations on the continent. So now what we have again is a form of neo-colonialism where people are owning all of this data, where streamers or other external parties are coming into the continent and saying, this is what everyone wants to watch. And then they only commission that. And then that's all people get to watch. And then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think for me, I mean, Joss proposed she posed an interesting proposition, like, why isn't data like Creative Commons? I think we should start talking about like interesting solutions towards that. Like in Africa, maybe the solution here is thinking of an organization that's creative, you know, that has this Creative Common purpose, and where, you know, data is collated about audiences that is accessible to different creators, so that we can start making interesting projects that can be able to cut across different audiences, like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya. Maybe that's what we should be thinking about, instead of recreating capitalistic structures.
And I see Alessandro has his hand up. Alessandro.
Yeah, we wanted just to come in on the issue of platforms, saying that, I mean, it has both good and bad aspects to it, but I think it is important also that we don't forget that there are, it touches only a very small minority of the audience, and there are still so many other ways of making film circulate around Africa that are in so many ways also more effective. And there are also in themselves ways of conceiving and imagining alternatives, even if they don't have the level of capital, potential that a big platform might have. But you can see also how this thing just oppose each other. I think about Nigeria, for instance, where you have Netflix who have come in strongly, and this connects to a certain kind of production which reaches and is oriented towards certain audiences, maybe the local elite and mostly the diaspora. But then you have still a bunch of producers who still go maybe on the straight to video market. I'm thinking at the Azaba producers. Femi, you might tell me if it's still something that happens. But I mean, let's say producers that still work in a more of a older system of small scale productions, thought and conceived for local audiences. And I think that still we should not forget about the existence of all that world, which is still pretty influential in many countries, and somehow with all the problems that it presents as well in terms of the contents, of the quality of what is done and whatever, but still it is a form of alternative that can offer us at least food for thoughts on how to imagine other ways of dealing with distribution and audience building, if compared to streaming platform that impose a model which is sort of unescapable. They are there, they dig the data, they run away with it.
I would like to continue with in the same line of thought, but as we go into that, I also would like to just most likely bring back to our space in Kenya as an example. What you've talked about, the differences of what the streamers have brought in and the kind of elite attraction and the diasporic attraction, then ask as an example, at the back of the questions for Kenyans. Has the entry of streamers in Kenya been able to help Riverwood, or is it killing Riverwood?
Okay, so I think that the issue of streamers, I think I can't take that issue and just and take out from the global issue of who's watching our films and how our local audiences are reaching our films. I think this is a constant issue for the last 40 years, 30 years. I mean, and the streamers are just a new player, but the paradigm of Western or external infrastructure coming to run the distribution and the promotion of our films is still the same. Well, let me just be concrete. For example, in my own country, in the Comoros, there's no cinemas. And I don't think while I'm talking to you, there's no projects of building cinemas in the 4 islands. So people are watching films through TV and smartphones. And the median age of a Comoros citizen is 20 years old. So for me, the main question is, how do you change those paradigms, knowing that it's a question of generations? So I'm just going back to be concrete. So in my country, the kids, the first venture, the first introduction to documentary or to African cinema is through the smartphones and international broadcasters or streamers. And so for them, it's not the African experience that they're looking at. It's just the global experience that they are going to and they are watching and consuming. So when I'm talking to them, they don't see themselves as African per se. They see them as part of a global experience of consuming streamings or streamers consuming through smartphones and all that. So, so for me, it's more about, do we have the power, or do we have the funds, or do we have the personal to change that paradigm? I'm not quite sure of that, because those kids are into something else already.
Yes, so kind of like it's a rejoinder, but addition to what Mohammed was saying is where there's the advantage of the streamers coming in, because what they've done for a lot of the local producers is add a sense of credibility to an industry that struggles whenever they're trying to get their projects off their feet and whenever they're trying to engage other people for co-productions in making their own projects. So, it doesn't hurt to tell someone that you have your film on Netflix. However, the reality is that the streamers come with a sense of idea of what they think the audiences want. So what they're doing, alluding to what Josh was saying, they're creating their own audiences. What that does, it leaves us as the content creators at the mercy of what they think our audiences want, rather than us creating our own content for what we want to do. So in that sense, there's an incredible danger in where our audiences are going based on the content that they're accessing at the same time, and how that would kill our ability to tell stories and films, for instance, like Softy. There's also the idea that they're at the mercy of the governments that be in the different places in the continent, because you don't want to be kicked out of a country where you're trying to build a market for. So that means that we kind of have to play in the safe space and kind of tell a certain kind of story for our films to get in certain kind of space. So that also becomes an impediment in any kind of growth we may have as a film industry in our space.
I also would like to hear a little bit about, yes, I can see Saitabao's hand coming up. I also would like to hear a bit of the experiences, especially also on the West African front, because I think Nollywood was really riding. Is it still moving on? Is it moving alongside the streamers and the like? That would be at a particular point, because I've seen Saitabao and I also saw El-Tahri's hand up. Saitabao.
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of amplify what Sam has just mentioned. The whole concept of streamers has always been there for a very long time, almost 10, 15 years ago. The issue is there was no particular that dominance of, a streaming platform, who can dominate and who can dictate the market. So the issue about that, it's sort of also creates a sort of, like for every filmmaker, of course, you want, it is your dream to get your film to be seen as wide, reach to different audiences as wide as possible. But sometimes the streamers sort of can come dictating their own terms. And of course, you understand it's a whole business model, but some of these terms kind of also affects the creativity moving forward to the future, because now people will try and sort of replicate what's already there in this streaming platforms, and sort of now say this is the benchmark. This is how a documentary film should be. So you should create a documentary film in the same format moving on forward. So it is advantageous and disadvantageous in different sense, but of course it also factors in that creativity aspect, and in terms of creating, it limits to a certain portion.
Yeah, I mean, it's more or less in the same zone of what Sam and Saitabao were saying, but I'll actually add on to that the whole aesthetic. Netflix, and I mean, I don't want to just pick on Netflix, but the streamers, Netflix is the one that is becoming the most visible, at least on the continent. They have a very clear aesthetic. And I was just talking the other day, this whole new trend of practically every film starts with a drone. The drone shot coming down, and as filmmakers, we know that the perspective of the camera is kind of the voice. So I keep wondering, are we listening? Whose voice are we listening when the drone comes from up there? Whose voice is it? And everything, like trying to make a film that is not in 4K, or that the aesthetic isn't that. I mean, it's become a formatting, not just of story, not just of structure, not just of the number of minutes, but I mean, when you go to, I actually heard this the other day, a friend of mine who made a very interesting experimental film, her father looks at it, says, but the images aren't good. They don't look like Netflix. They make better films, because this kind of bling, the beautiful image, becomes an aesthetic that we are required almost to live up to. And I think that changes the nature of how we engage with the topics we want to talk about. Voila.
I also had an echo that that drone is the streamer's voice. I had an echo come through. I don't know if it was the voice of God or who,
voila.
I don't know.
It's like I keep wondering, it's like, okay, so that's the vantage point. Whose is it?
Okay, we continue, and Jos, you had your hand up.
Participant.
Thanks. I think John and Shakruddin also have their hands up. Just to say, I was thinking about this, what Sam was saying in relation also to this idea of we want to create the audiences that we want to see is very important, because one of the things these companies, streaming companies, are not just content streaming, they are also harvesting data, to go back to who owns the data, in some cases for the purposes of really building their AI, which is the longhand of, they're really technology companies. And what better way to actually develop AI than through the distribution of content and the harvesting of data. So there is now a new development, which is, that there's artificial intelligence companies emerging that have laid claim to having created technologies that can read movie and TV screenplays in order to predict box office and investment performance. And these AI programs are now being used by several studios. And so when we allow them to create the audience, we will also be de facto handing over, again, now a kind of, we want to talk about co-creation with non-human technologies. There is, in fact, now a bigger problem coming, which is that AI will be then using that to discern, what's going to actually work. And so it's linked. And there was a panel the other day at CPH Docs where Ted Hope, who's a very well-known American producer who was just recently head of Amazon film production, talked about streamers. And it was interesting to consider that, while the art form, especially in documentary, is evolving, the industry for the most part is not rewarding creativity. In fact, the gaming space is actually far more rewarding of innovation in terms of what creative. And he noted that documentaries, while they're benefiting from the big global streamers that are looking to build their audiences, that we need to really be careful because big players prefer documentaries with mass appeal. And so he said one of the key things to recognize is the streamers' need for a targeted audience at a low price point, that's their equation for efficiency. And so the most valuable type of audience member for a streamer is the new audience member. How do they attract new people to the platform? That in fact, it's not profit or loss that's their end game. It's much more customer acquisition. Wow. So, documentaries are appealing to them because they don't cost a lot and they may bring on a new, very specific audience to the platform. But the problem for creators is that we need a strong enough cohort to actually push back on what is that content. It's not about curation. It's not about discovery. It's not about adding value around a specific title. It's something much different because the business of global streaming is about customer acquisition. And the best way to do that is to get people to all do the same thing, is what Ted pointed out. So, I mean, the interfaces are designed to promote the shiny and new, Jihan, which is why the aesthetic is that way also. And the algorithm is not giving you more of what you actually want. It's more about designing a system to make everyone like what they get. So you get crap like Tiger King and Octopus Teacher. Sorry, but that's a fact. And that's, people love it. Do they? Do they even know what else is out there that they might like better? So how do we get, the idea of global audience is going to help us maintain a cultural specificity? How do we get to this question of how we create a progressive inclusion, a respect for different forms of innovation and storytelling, instead of a more extractive practice of cherry picking? This is actually where co-creation, collaboration, collective approach become really important as a force. One of the benefits of Africa actually is, in fact, that there's still time to actually address this collectively.
Does it then, without answering the question, does it then mean that the coming into Africa by the streamers is mainly to continue widening the customer base and increase the numbers and be able to attract new audiences? Put that at the back of your mind. I have Joanne and Shukru who had their hands up.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. Hi.
Okay. Yeah. So,
Shakuru.
Yeah, Shakiruddin.
Shakiruddin. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So, I think that collaboration is very important, with regards to this streamers, issue. And I want to look at it from the angle of, why is it that as Africans, why have we not been able to create, a platform that is as big or as strong as like the Netflix or like the other, streaming platforms? I mean, I'm like happy to learn, but I know that as Africans, we used to be communal people, we used to be people who, had this communal sense. But from my experience, working with foreign media or foreign crew who come into Africa, I think that as Africans, we are still more individualistic, as compared to being collaborative. So we have Africans, I believe, who have the capacity to actually invest, into the infrastructure that we need to be able to compete on a global scale. But it appears, we are still doing things on that small level. Everybody, I don't know if it's from a place of distrust or mistrust, or from a place of just trying to play, safe. And so it appears that everybody is doing something small, because we kind of see so many people, different groups of people who are trying to create platforms, streaming platforms, but then we have not been able to, really collaborate and really scale, so that then we kind of have that voice that is strong enough to actually push the kind of stories that we want to push. So in the end, it still comes back to a game of numbers, and then other giants or streamers really are able to dictate what really goes on at the end. That's what, yeah.
That's I think it's a great contribution. It's a great idea. But at the same time, I think we've got to be alive to the fact that even just collaborations within our own regions, whether it is West Africa, East Africa, or collaborating within the country, those are still matters that we need to be looking at, because we've been here for around 8 years. And at the beginning, even for filmmakers to collaborate amongst themselves was quite difficult. So the issue of coming up with the Netflix, yeah, maybe it's worth thinking. Johan, let me go to you.
Hello, guys. My name is Joan. I'm a film producer based in Nairobi, Kenya. So my thought line was the same as Shakiruddin. And I think for me, when I view streamers getting into the African market and within the African content, I also see it being a danger that it kills the African organizations that are banding together, Shakiruddin was saying, in terms of creating content platforms where people can view. I'll give an example, like the Creative Garage in Kenya has Calabash, which curates Kenyan content. And this is not something that really has received much upload of people on it, or even I think publicity as it should have. So we have guys like Netflix joining the Kenyan market, the East African, or generally the African market, with the kind of audiences that we currently have in Africa. They're more aligned to move towards, creating their Netflix account, their Showmax account. And I see it as a way that now we have audience division in terms of how do you now promote the locally made streaming platforms. There was also one in Uganda, but I've actually just forgotten the name. Someone who else is trying to build a platform. And you see some of these platforms really do not have the financial capacity. So what they're doing is they're inviting content creators to put their content on these platforms that they're making, in the hopes that you will gain your profits later on, which will be a shared, they do this shared ratio percentage thing, which when you agree, you sign on to that. So we see that there's an issue of financing for these markets. There's also audience segmentation in terms of Africa, because we also have language barriers. So and this also goes, I think, back to colonialization. We have the Arab markets, we have the French market, the Portuguese market, the English speaking, the Swahili speaking markets. So how are we as Africa? And that's just a question that I'll pose, that the different ways we were colonized is the different ways that we as Africans relate and form relations, and this has worked for us and also has not worked for us. So in the bid of making this Netflix that is a big network within Africa, we also need to see how do we sort of like break the barriers that were formed between African countries during colonization.
So in conclusion, because we are just coming to a close, and I want to believe that you still have something to throw forward as a contribution as panelists and those who have been able to attend with us. could we be able to just pick on maybe one of the greatest delights of collaboration and co-creation, maybe one or two? What is it that makes it tick, and what is it that should most likely be able to, what should we push forth? And the same thing would happen to the streamers, and maybe then go to the other end and say, this is the worst thing that happens to us because of collaboration and co-creation. And this is the worst thing that has happened to us because of the streamers coming to the space. I want to go to both extremes because I think the middle ground will find itself when you go to the both extremes.
Before you go there, may I just add this to the conversation that's been had about streamers?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the streamers have aggregators.
Yeah.
Those aggregators are country-based. Most of the streamers have executives who are now commissioning work. And just like in the days of slave trade, where the slave ships stayed at the port, but there were middlemen who were Africans who brought the slaves from the inner villages. It's the same way we've got African aggregators and African executives who are at the spaces and who basically are shepherding, the content in a certain predetermined direction. We have cliques that are forming where you actually basically can look at some of those things on the streaming platforms, and they're basically the same group of filmmakers whose films so there is a way in which there is really no representation, either in the themes, the subject matters, or even the filmmakers or the artists through, whose eyes these things are being done. So I do think we also need to address that, how it turns, our aggregators and our executives almost become enemies of the filmmaker themselves, and how, whilst that's very popular on the fiction front, it becomes choking on the documentary front, because documentary is this thing where the filmmaker is also very passionate about the subject, is also very involved with the subject, is also needing it to do much more than make money. So we're also talking of audience aggregation as part of the principal thing that these platforms are looking for. Doesn't that then almost make it all political? And why it becomes almost necessary that streaming platforms for African documentaries be something that we are keen to develop. I have no idea what happened to Mokolo, for instance. It went on and on for 5 years and nothing came off of it. But I'm almost, not sure what to think of that, because that was also going to be with German money. So we've got to figure out a way in which our conversations are not about, people allowing us space, but us figuring out what are the paths we need to take to actually establish windows for the work that we do. I think that's important. I saw Mohammed talk about working with Nigerian streamers. There's a lot of Nigerian streamers. The same thing is happening to local streamers. Every part of Africa is happening to the Nigerian streamers, but Nigerian streamers is probably luckier because it's got a base audience that is homegrown. So there is a way in which I suspect the streamers in Nigeria are going to do well, but the cleavages, the gaps will still emerge because, unless you really become an African with the streaming, the dislocations in Nigeria tend to eat up, those sort of initiatives themselves. But we need to talk about how do we look at distribution for documentary within Africa that is actually got the same ambitions that we as filmmakers have.
I think that slave analogy and the ships and the aggregators is a heavy one on the crazy side of aggregation. So I want to go now if there's any on the positive side of aggregation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on the idea of aggregation. I think one of the challenges, Africa is a very diverse continent, but people are operating in silos. And I think we need to think of more ways that we can collaborate, more ways that we can aggregate data, because this data is there, it's just in silos. And for example, when we're talking about audiences, data about audiences, like for example, there are a lot of educational production companies that do M&E, to be able to do fundraising, monitoring and evaluation of audiences. When we're doing impact producing and distribution, which is been relatively new to documentary the last 10 years, we collect data about like how well our film did, who watched it. We need to start aggregating this data and figuring out ways that it can be accessible to filmmakers and to distributors, because I think it's commendable that there are all of these different platforms coming up, but how strong are their algorithms? Like how strong is their technology that's underpinning the company? Because at the end of the day, like Josh said, the business behind the business with a lot of these streamers is that it's about, it's about acquiring data. It's about creating AI. AI needs data, and things like that. So I think it's also just about figuring out okay, how do we start, collaborating? And I think data collection, even of these people who do mobile cinema outreach, how do we start collating that data? Because I think if we start looking at everything together, we might start understanding what the audiences look like in different regions and across the continent in a more holistic manner.
So I think you go into the issue of data is king, and I think it's something to really think about when as you come towards the conclusion of this discussion. Data collection in Africa. So if you have any other word, or just has a hand up.
I just want to say, I think streamers, as with any technology or any new evolution, of a business, it's really so much about the ethics of it. And so I think there's many really well-intentioned, great people who are trying to do work and create good opportunities. And I think it's very difficult to resist these opportunities because of some of the monies being spent. It depends, there is a local budget versus a global budget in terms of how projects are conceived. And I think that there has been a kind of egregious deployment of initiatives designed to really harvest as much content or as many good ideas as possible for the least amount of money possible when it comes to Africa. But I also see initiatives where people are trying to create opportunities and employment, and there are some streamers, and I would say in the States, Netflix has definitely helped move the needle on elevating particularly directors of color, particularly Black directors, and that it has opened more opportunities. So I don't want to, as Jihan said, throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. But I also think it comes with a huge price, and that we need to really, I'm very concerned about audience, and I'm really concerned about censorship issues. This is the case in India, China, Brazil. There's a lot of concern in the documentary community about these businesses wanting to build their businesses in these very large countries or even smaller countries and being worried about being tossed out. It's also a conversation in the philanthropy community. But I would say the multiplicity of outlets, the multiplicity of collectives can only help.
Okay, as part of what you've said, if I was to talk about a bit about the discontents, it will be the variations on the budgets of the streamers when it comes to the way they view Africa vis-a-vis how they view Europe or the Americas or even the Asian countries. The budgets, when you look at ownership, there are issues of ownership and the perpetual ownership, and there needs to be something that needs to be done. But also just looking at it in general, as documentary filmmakers, we are so particular about the impact of the film, but I think the streamers look a lot more on the numbers. And I want to say that as Jihan concludes, I'll be throwing it back to Mohammed. In case there's something burning from the panelists, let me know, so that as I hand over to Mohammed, we'll be coming to a conclusion. But it's been a very healthy debate. Jihan, El-Tahri.
I go along again with everything just said, but I think one of the recognitions we have to have is that the streamers are not going away.
Mm-hmm.
The real issue is, how do we maintain alternative spaces, and so we're not totally gobbled up either by the way they write their contracts, or the way they conduct their business, or the way their aesthetic and the rest of it. Allowing the existence of an alternative voice, for me, has never seemed harder. And usually it has been an issue of, how do I join the global market? Now the global market is eating us all up. So how do we keep a little space that allows some kind of diversity? And I think that again, as Joss just said, and what Toni was saying, the collaboration and what John was saying, these collectives, the idea of, we can hold hands, we don't have to merge into one another, but we can circulate. And on that note, I will talk, I hope Mohammed will talk more about it. That's one of the things we tried to do amongst with our new group called ARC, which is coordinating the different documentary groups on the continent, coordinating together. It's not about doing the same thing. Each one of us has our separate identity, but if there's something out there that I think is more suitable for you rather than for me, we can exchange. I think and that's a bit of an answer to Shakiruddin, is one of the biggest traumas in African cinema, or in African audiovisual space in general, is that we have been convinced somehow that the pie is not big enough, that there's always only space for one name at the top, and nobody can remember or spell anybody else's name. But that is not the case. The more we are, the more we work together, the more there is space for us. And it's, how do we invert this equation that I think is the real issue? And how do we live alongside the streamers, oblige the streamers to talk to us on eye level if we want to work with them? I'm not saying ban the streamers. I'm not saying boycott the streamers. But if you're going to work with me, you better work with me on equal terms.
I would like to say thank you to all of you, Alessandro, Femi, Jihan, Joslyn, Saitabao, Sam, Soko, Toni, Kamau. But it's been a lovely discussion with you. I want to believe that it's going to inform a lot of what we do in our regions and in Africa as a whole. As part of the DocuBox team, as the programs director at DocuBox, I think this discussion is going to also enrich what we do and how we act and how we deal moving forward. So thank you all as the experts who are involved and who are in this panel. Allow me please to hand this over to the CEO of DocA, Mohammed Ouma. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mudamba. Thank you to all the panelists. A great thank you on my behalf, on the behalf of the board. And just a quick words about the ARC. I think the pandemic gave us a reason to gather last year for many months to create this Africa Real Collective, which is an alliance of documentary organization on the continent. And we are working on the platform, and the platform will give you, will help circulate information and resources to all the filmmakers, all the documentary filmmakers and stakeholders on the continent. And it also, like Jihan just said, also a way for us to get away from all those paradigms that we've talked about. And this is a continent of the predation. Predation is all over the place. And this collective, we're trying to break away from those old impasses and trying to find new formulations. And I really want to thank you all. So have a nice day or nice evening. And I hope we catch up soon. Thank you, Mudamba.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate your
Thank you,
moderation.
sir.
Stay safe.